Hello, everyone. We're live. This is Future Disabled, episode 3. I'm here with Connor Franklin, who is a terrific human being, former coworker of mine, and like an excellent colleague to get to know if you ever have the pleasure of working with Connor. So, Connor, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. It's so nice to see you.
It's nice to see you.
So I'm a web developer by trade, and I found my way into web accessibility while contracting with the U.S. General Services Administration several years ago. They enforce and document Section 508, and I was lucky enough to work with their first iteration of the design system. And that was my introduction to accessibility. Worked with some great people over there who were very helpful in testing. It really woke me up to the importance of accessibility, and it's dovetailed really well with sort of a passion that I have for semantics to begin with. So that's the direction at which I'm coming at this right now.
Awesome. Yeah. So how did you get more involved with leading designers? You were on a systems team, correct?
Yeah, so I've always been working very, very closely with designers. I think initially because where I started, I was expected to do a certain amount of what you might call design in addition to my web dev work. Mm-hmm. And then when I finally began working with design teams, I found that everything worked better when there was like a bi-directional exchange. And this is an issue, of course, that companies are still dealing with, and some do it better than others, as you know. But to me, like, design and dev have to play off each other, and there has to be communication. It can't just be, the adage is you can't just like throw a design over the fence and say, make it look like this. you just can't, not if you want it to look like that and work the way it's supposed to. This is not a purely visual ecosystem. So if you design from a purely visual approach, you're missing a huge piece of the spectrum.
Absolutely. I know that one of the big turning points for me was realizing like all those pretty designs on Dribble, they don't often work in real life because we have so many constraints that we have to deal with, like the technology stack that we're using or legacy designs. Like people get really upset when you change stuff on them. So if you change it too much, it's like, am I in the wrong place? What building am I in? It's the same way with product design as well. So we have to consider that we're not designing and developing in a vacuum. And I feel like you've taken that into consideration really well. And also, I feel like there's this big conception about developers that they don't like design.
I've heard that before.
But my experience with developers is very different, that developers, for the most part, love well-designed things because they work well.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think all the best designers love working with developers because they have that inherent interest in the medium itself. And that's very important because you can't, as a designer, supply the correct amount of context, I don't think, to your developers or to your product people without having like the purpose of what you're designing obvious. And on the other end, we can't code or create like a fully like universally accessible product unless we have a full understanding of that product. Otherwise, we're not expressing the purpose of the product across the whole spectrum.
Absolutely. I think too, when we consider context, a lot of people don't think about the systems that things function within. They don't think about development as being part of that system. So they're not thinking about like, oh, well, I'm making this design and then it's got to go somewhere. Like they're just thinking about it as like, I made the design, it's done. But it often we're making it go into this context that we're not considering as designers. And I agree that the best designers are really curious, and knowing how the thing that I made turns into a product, I think is really, really interesting to me personally. And I think to a lot of designers, it should be more interesting and it should be a point of curiosity. And so like understanding not maybe how to write industry top level code, but understanding at least how code works and how those things get turned into products is really, a differentiator.
And then on top of that, like depending on what sort of environment you're working on or working in, like maybe the reason that you're not having that back and forth discussion is more structural and less personal. So sometimes like what I've found in some gigs is like first I have to break down a bunch of barriers to have that discussion or reach that understanding. And that's something that has become even more clear working in accessibility, especially interfacing with designers and developers. I think a lot of people have had a small amount of experience with accessibility, and a lot of times it's just kind of been the ultimate fire drill for them. And it's been the ultimate, slap on this remediation really quick and we'll get out of here. And for a lot of people, it's, that was the issue that kept me up until however late, however many days in a row. So that has created for me, any place where I've worked in accessibility or where my job has been to enforce web standards, is like first you have to approach it as like an evangelist and not as a police officer, because that's sometimes what folks are expecting.
Right. Yeah, I was talking with James from UsableNet last week, and James is making this software, but it's a web app, so it runs very much like some of the things that you hacked together while we were still working together to basically automate some of the testing that you can do. So like running user paths and doing screen reader testing or doing contrast checking and things like that. So the way that I'm thinking about it is that those things should be baked in just like any other QA testing. And the things that I'm thinking about is then taking it a step further so that we can automate the things that can be automated, and then we can spend our time and energy worrying about the things that can't be. Because I think it's kind of a waste of my time as a designer to be like looking at that and going like, this hex code and this hex code, what percentage is that? A computer can do that for me. But
right.
It's just like design systems. Like, why argue over the size of this button versus that button, or the colors of these buttons, when we can solve that once, and then we can work on what does the button do? We can talk about the ideas rather than the actions.
Yeah, exactly. Two things about that. Like, you made a really good point, I think, on that episode where you were sort of talking about automation. I think you use like spell check or like autocorrect for accessibility, and why that isn't possible.
Yes.
And what you said was because you can't automate critical thinking.
Yes.
And that's what you're saying. Like, we're making more room for the important decisions that actually require bidirectional debate and require that critical thinking from everyone involved. And the second thing I would say kind of related to that is sort of like once you're through the initial stage of it, like I'm in the process of trying to inject accessibility and sort of an awareness of universal design into as much of my company's pipeline as possible. And there's sort of like a shock and awe like situation where first you come in and you say, okay, here are all the things that are wrong. And here's why it's bad. And sort of if you go about it that way, like if I went about it that way, I found myself sort of like people coming to me for every single individual thing. Like you were saying about the individual hex code. Yes, we want to express the importance of it, but we also don't want it to become an individual, every color one at a time deal. So we have to come up with automation just to test and validate everything so that designers can move confidently from stage to stage without maybe always having to check in on every single item. But then also, in order to have consistency in accessibility specific decisions, we have to have consistent strategy among our UI elements. So for example, if we're wondering, like let's say you have any component, any UI element, and color consistency, the strength of that consistency varies from each individual color in that element. Well, so an accessibility team or an audit might come back, even an automated audit might come back and say, well, these parts of the component, these cues have sufficient contrast, are accessible, but these aren't. So you bring that back to a team and you might say, okay, well, we have to make some trade-offs here. which of these elements or which of these cues do we think are critical to making this interaction clear to a user, and which ones can we sort of sacrifice and say we don't have to do that? And that, I think, is a danger, because if you make that from a purely accessibility perspective, well, right there, you're bifurcating your user experience. And if you're going to do that, if you have to do that, you really need consistency from the UX side to say, okay, if we're saying like outlines are critical because they provide sufficient cue for such and such a component, but background colors do not, well, okay, if it's true for this component, let's make it consistent across all of them. Or at the very least, when the question comes up, I want to have a response that says, okay, we already know what's important to us as far as making this paradigm clear to all users. And then from there, we can say, okay, which ones of these like fit the WCAG requirement and which ones do not. So I guess what it boils down to is you have to have a clear UX strategy to have a clear accessibility strategy, at least at that stage.
I feel like too, they kind, like one hand washes the other. It's kind of like accessibility is inherently part of UX. And I recently saw a thread about this literature professor was talking about how it's the hardest thing he has to do is to explain to his students how we're not finding hidden meaning in literature. We're just examining it under a more powerful microscope, basically. Mm-hmm. And the thing that I am struggling, it just like lit this light bulb over my brain, because I was like, the thing I'm struggling with is explaining to people that we're not adding on accessibility, just like we weren't adding on UX. We were just examining it under a microscope and saying, you know what? The lack of making these critical decisions is a choice. Like, it's there whether we want it to be or not. Like, the lack of a good customer experience is a choice. And so like by just like dedicating some critical thought and brain space to it, we're just examining it more. And I think that like people think that they're two separate things, but they're two hands of the same creature.
And once you begin consistently doing that exercise, right? Thinking mm-hmm. about everything you build from the most inclusive perspective possible, applying empathy to all of these decisions. Well, now I think everyone is thinking more clearly about UX. Like, good accessibility thinking is good UX thinking. You can't really have one without the other. And then I think the same applies on the development end, right? Just generally, especially for front-end development on the web, quality code and correct usage and a correct expression through semantics, that is something that you'll discover in an accessibility through accessibility if you haven't already discovered it. But of course, ideally, you find, okay, well, we've been using semantic elements correctly. We've been structuring our pages clearly. And so we're already most of the way there. So I think communicating with any team or any specialty, like, it's important to explain the importance of it first, I think, from an empathetic, like, moral perspective, but also from a, look, these are best practices across the spectrum. These are best practices everywhere. And we get a lot more wins out of this than maybe the narrow application that we have in mind. So for marketing, you can even talk about SEO, right? More semantic organization of the page, more thoughtful copywriting, SEO improvement. And for development, you could say performance improvement, right? And then the performance improvement improves accessibility as well. You get a less janky page, you get a quicker load, you get, less cognitive load as you're moving between items. So it's just, I think there are additional benefits that you can list, and you can sort of use that to bring together teams that otherwise don't see themselves as very aligned.
Another thing that I'm noticing is a lot of insights that people have gathered and that they're still working from are more than a decade old. So a lot of what we know about marketing and what we know about return on investment and what we know about even just the users that we're working with is outdated. And because people aren't investing in testing, or, they're like, oh, well, we tested it we tested one feature, but they're not like really getting into, they're doing A/B testing. They're doing UI testing. They're not doing as much of usability testing or UX or UX strategy testing. They're not getting into the intents and the concerns that users have right now. And so it's kind of like this business driven testing. It's not human driven testing. And so what I've noticed is that as I've been having like conversations with people and asking them like, what makes a good day for you? People are like, what? Like, you want to know like what my concerns are and what drives me and like what frustrates me. And so these kinds of questions are then revealing these bigger problems that people aren't aware of when they're thinking about doing testing. And when I talk to people that have disabilities, I find that their concerns are very close to mine. So what I think is like my anecdotal concern then becomes like a phenomenon, an observed phenomenon. And I think that testing is like such a big part of this. Is that also your experience that testing is like really key to including accessibility?
It has to be, and I just can't get enough user testing. That I don't think I'll ever be able to, because it's just the most profound learning experience anytime you actually get to like work with a customer or work with a user or whoever, because you just get insights that you're never going to get in a more rigid or more like automated testing plan. You're never going to get it. And even if we tested as much as we could, we're still going to be like, that amount of insight can still be overwhelmed from this idea that like everyone working on this uses it too, but in a very different way. So yeah, testing, I mean, there's nothing more important. You can only build so much empathy without having this face-to-face, like human interaction. And that's like only going to become more important now that we're all, remaining indoors and chatting through webcam and all of that.
Yeah, I had a conversation recently where somebody was asking about visual impairments, and they were asking me, they were like, hey, so when you used a screen reader, did you use it for design, or were you not doing design when you used a screen reader? And I was like, well, it depends on the day. It depends on the month. It depends on, like what was going on, because I've had like so many different things going on with my eyes. And then they were asking me like specific questions about it and how I use screen readers and Zoom and other assistive technology in my workflow. And then it occurred to me, because they had said, we're not going to optimize for screen readers right now because there aren't any people that have such bad eyesight that they would need to use a screen reader and also be designing. That's just like that's not going to happen. And then I was like, wait, you obviously like the whoever decided that never talked to a product team, because there are UX writers, there's product owners, there's developers, there are designers that might be doing things that don't require heavy visual design, like interaction designers or strategists. And also it really does depend on the day. Like maybe I was doing specs and just like exporting things, and I wanted to use a screen reader to be faster. So we really talked and delved into like the excruciating detail of that. But it's been revealed to me, like through me talking to other people about my disability, that people just like, it's just like so many assumptions go into whether or not testing will be done or whether or not they will even talk to users, which is just amazing to me.
Right. Well, you have a really unique insight through your experience that sort of touches on part of how we segment people who are using assistive devices. We sort of make that. It's very tempting to make it like just an all-encompassing label, like screen reader people. But that's that, like, if that's how you're defining that segment, well, like you're not thinking very deeply about your users. And if you're not thinking very deeply about your users and you're segmenting users with disabilities in a way where you no longer think of them as the same as another customer, well now you're bifurcating your experience again. Like I've come across in a bunch of different sectors, explanatory text in the form of alt text or an ARIA label, where like very, very general terms are being explained very, very deeply, but that text is not available visually. So there's this implication there. And I think it's like, it's writers or probably last minute remediators, to be fair, last minute remediators thinking like, well, I don't know anything about these folks except that they have various limitations. So I'm just going to assume they have all limitations. I don't know. It's just a funny thing.
Yeah. Also, I think one of the first things that you and I worked on together was like talking about ARIA labels on buttons. And I was like, no, it tells you that it's a button. So like, we don't need to know to click here.
Oh yeah. When it says like, this is a button and this is what it's going to do.
Yeah, and so like the screen readers automatically tell you that. So the ARIA label doesn't need to tell you to click here on a link or a button or anything like that. And so I think that was like actually one of the first conversations that we had was either with that or about like navigation or something like that. And ARIA labels are just something that I think is just so misunderstood, because even if you are completely blind, like you're using a screen reader all the time, and so developers are like, oh, well, I really need to explain what this navigation item does, or I really need to explain what this landmark does. And we're just over here like, oh my gosh, like I use this all the time. Thank you. I know what a link is.
Yeah. Or even the subject of the site itself. Like if I'm on a website buying pants, like I don't need like a 2-sentence explanation of what pants are.
Yes, it's very akin to that. And then like we'll get a really descriptive alt image that's like sunlight is streaming in through this window. There's a pair of pants on the table and blah, 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 blah. And I'm just like squinting at this image going, yeah, but like what are the pants about? Like, why do I care about the pants? What print is on the pants? Like, there's so much information that you've told me about this photo, but none of it is helpful to me. And I use the example of listening as a sighted person, like watching some of the Netflix shows, that because Netflix has now moved to all of their original shows having audio descriptions. So turning down the brightness on your iPad or TV or whatever, and watching a Netflix original show with the audio descriptions on. And The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, if you're up for it, is one that I like and has awful audio descriptions because all of the emotions are furrowed brows. Like it doesn't matter what emotion it is, it's a furrowed brow. Sabrina's brow furrowed, somebody else's brow furrowed, everybody's brow is furrowed. And then if you listen to The Good Place, which is not a Netflix original, but it's available on a lot of platforms, they also have audio descriptions. And they're so rich and they're so emotional. It does not describe every single action that happens, like people walking around or putting things in their mouth or whatever. But that's not the information that I'm trying to get from the show. It's a very emotional and it's a very like philosophical show. So I'm able to hear the audio of the people talking, and then I'm able to have the emotions and the important events described. And that is kind of like how we need to think about alt images as well. So learning things like that, I think, is really important for people that don't have the disability that they're designing for, and finding ways that they can cultivate that empathy. And I think that you've done a really good job of that because you really seek out and listen to people that have disabilities. What are some other ways that you've done that? And what are some ways that you're still working on that?
So one of the things that we've started to do, it's sort of been a hit, kind of cross-platform, in addition to just the fabulous proof of concepts that my colleagues build every day when we're documenting, potential improvements to components or flows. Sometimes we'll take videos or audio of those flows being used and include either voiceover or NVDA readback as you traverse through the DOM. And I think that makes it click for not just for developers and designers, but also for product people in like management and just maybe even like for the first time, seeing how a screen reader parses a site and what the experience could be. And we go ahead and we do it when the experience is good, and we do it when the experience is bad. And sometimes like the comedy of like a really bad screen reader experience, like that also flips a switch in folks, like, because everybody can empathize with a really frustrating experience on the web or with an app, right? It's something that we complain about online and to each other like all the time. Everybody gets it. And in one of the WebAIM surveys, it might have been like the 2017 one, there was an open question that said basically, what do you do when you arrive in a flow or a site or an app and you can't figure out how to make that first step within 5 or 10 seconds? And
You leave.
yeah, exactly. You go find your competitor's site, right? And that's, when you read through all that feedback, it's like, yeah, this is how everybody feels.
Mm-hmm.
If we present a terribly frustrating experience, or even really at the beginning when we're onboarding a temporarily frustrating experience, that's it. So proof of concepts are big. Video is big. And what I'm starting to do is distribute video and audio together. So you can listen to just purely the audio of whatever QuickTime capture I've made, and then follow it with the video. So if in the audio it's unclear where you are at any point in time during that audio, and then you add the video in, well, now it's clarifying. Now we can sort of find the difference and say, okay, where is the visual cue that makes this easy to understand for a sighted user, but not for someone else?
So if you're interested in reading some of the Twitter ones that are like that, or are using those as an educational item for either you or anybody that's watching, I have a couple penned to my resource list that I'm building on my profile on Twitter. It's really funny because people that are using like those funky emojis to build their, like the letter emojis to build like their username, it sounds hilarious. Some of them sound like an eldritch creature is reading it, or some sort of robot. And then also when people use a lot of emojis within tweets, also very hard. There's also a couple where people like use these like meme formats where it's like somebody inside of a house and it's got like lots of slashes and stuff built. Or it's a format where there's two pictures and you put like part of the text and then another sentence and then part of the text. It's sort of like the thing where from Walking Dead where it says dead inside don't open or something like
Right.
that. Yeah, but it ends up being kind of like that meme format. It sounds like totally garbled if you're listening to it with a screen reader, but it makes for a lot of comedy. So sometimes people record it so that you can hear what it sounds like, and it's really great. It's great for education as well to let people know like you can be more inclusive with how you're presenting yourself on social media or to the world in general. But that's one thing that it's easy to take these things and to say like, I never thought about that. But then when you're presented with it, I feel like there's almost no going back. You know,
sure.
Like once you're not ignorant anymore, it feels like as a designer, who cares about what people's experiences are? There's almost no going back. Do you find that it's like a harder experience with developers, or do you feel like the developers that you're working with have a good grasp on user experience and they're like really concerned about human design?
Well, it definitely depends on the company and the team and the product. I mean, there have been so many times in the past where I've been working on products that are legacy in a way where everything will always be a retrofit. It's not a question of whether our universal design efforts are going to be a retrofit. It's like everything is always a retrofit. But as far as like actively developing platforms, well, I think we can build that empathy, but I definitely try and use like the side door of semantics and performance and clean code, or sometimes it's just as simple as saying, look at all of this semantic value and functionality you get for free from this existing HTML element, right, from the spec. And that's free. And not only is it free, but it's more maintainable. And not only is it more maintainable, but it's as universally accessible as you're going to get for the gold star HTML elements. not all of them. So it's all, yeah, I guess it's all about like finding parallels to make that effort worthwhile. And, you know, every developer, every designer, every person, every team has different priorities, and they come at this a different way, especially in design and dev, where I think a lot of us have found ourselves in this industry coming from elsewhere. Everyone's got a different perspective, is differently motivated. But the nice thing about inclusive design is it's for everybody, and like that's baked right in. So making it understandable and meaningful for everybody you're working with, I think that becomes a lot easier.
So let's chat about retrofitting a little bit, because I think a lot of people are going through this right now, and you're maybe coming out the other side of it a little bit, or at least the bulk of it.
That would be nice, but no, we're still pretty deep in it.
Okay, so but this is something that you've been going through, and I think now you've gained some experience with trying to retrofit something and trying to remediate your user experience and your code base, at the same time trying to develop new projects and new features and new designs with accessible design. So how are you balancing that, and how do you wrap your brain around that?
Right. Well, so I have a very small team right now, so it's an imperative that we find a way to share the work and make it natural, a natural part of our flow, and make it sustainable. So it's really got to be like a three-pronged effort. We have the immediate remediation that needs to be done. It's super high priority. We have sort of the sustainable design system, sort of global approach to building everything new accessible, but also making sure that can continue to be accessible. And then there's the education that makes that possible. So they all kind of dovetail into each other. We do make a lot of asks of development teams, and I've done this sort of historically, rather than just saying direct, like there's an accessibility development team, they make changes to every product. Well, you can do that, and lots of companies do, but then you find yourself a couple months or a couple years in the future saying, when we remediated it, it was accessible, but now we've added these features and it's not accessible. Now we have to remediate again. And you could do that forever. So one of the ways we're trying to create a little bit more buy-in in the initiative and ensure that we are maintaining our investment into remediation is to allow certain remediated features to backflow into our design system. So if there's a particular feature that on a page is inaccessible for any number of reasons, and we find that we already have a component, but that component needs we need to raise the standard of that component, we'll ask the development team, rather than remediating the current component, to help improve our current component and then use it. So now, in the same amount of work, hopefully, we've remediated a particular page, and we've provided a component that meets our standards and hopefully future standards that we can roll out to other sites or pages or flows. And then I've done a lot of standalone education. And I like to open it with those like videos and audio, because great way to break the ice. But I think a lot of the continuing education happens within the projects themselves. So when we're working on remediation, we're not necessarily writing all the code, but we're code reviewing a decent amount of it. And that is another place for that education to occur. So at first, it's big picture. Why does this matter to the world? Why does it matter to me and my team? Why does it matter to my company? But then, in addition, I guess, like here are the basics. Once you get into that code review, now you really have that back and forth. You have that dialogue, and it becomes a little bit more natural. So regardless of what team or what segment of the pipeline I'm working with, I'm trying to not only provide instant relief. It sounds like Malox, but it's not. Provide instant relief, right? Remediate, and then second, see if that remediation can be standardized and used elsewhere. But then third, make sure that the process is occurring in a way where everyone is learning something. And then hopefully when it comes time to add that new feature, developers or designers or product people are taking their experience from remediation and bringing that into the future state.
Awesome. So talking about future states, I've been talking with a lot of people about like the future of accessibility development and where it's kind of going as an industry. And I feel like a lot of the education has been stuck on a very like intro 101 kind of level. And what I'm hearing is that people, they desire to know more. They want to know more. They want to learn. They want to grow. And they want to kind of know what's next. Like, how do we, what is next for accessibility in general? Do you have any thoughts on like what is the next level for creating accessibility and what you see would be like a good, maybe just the next step for how we can do better?
Well, earlier in our discussion, you said something that like kind of frightened me. You said like some of our like UX research or the way we go about testing is based on assumptions that are like 10 or more years old. And I just thought to myself, oh no, not only because the technology has moved forward since then, but also because the internet is for more people or available to more people than it was 10 or of course 20 or 30 years ago. So, you know, we have to think about it as something for everybody. And when we say everybody, we mean absolutely everybody. So not only do we have to expand our idea of who our user is, but also we have to realize that like a lot of the R&D that's made the current state of our digital lives possible has even more of an effect on people who are deaf or blind. Like the idea of this like personal assistant, for example, that follows us around everywhere we go. Like that's such a huge deal. And I think we're all starting to kind of take it for granted. We have to sort of acknowledge that with this extra power from these, you know, exceptionally accessible like devices, at least compared to 10 years ago, we have that much more of a responsibility to make sure that we are leveraging all of those features and abilities for everyone. So yeah, it's like convenient to have a speech-powered device, like for me, but it's such a huge breakthrough for others and for everyone. So, and maybe that will help us figure out what the next step is. I think in the past it was who can we expand this digital life or the internet to, and I think there's still a ways to go there. But now that, you know, so much of the world is connected all the time and bringing with them their own experiences and perspectives and needs and desires, we have to figure out really how to build for everyone and not think about who specifically is everyone. Well, no, everyone. So I hope I answered your question. It's a big world out there.
Yeah, no, it really is. And one of the concerns that I've had recently is that our design education system is so far behind, which of course, like I have some qualms about industrialized education around design in general, just because it makes it very inaccessible. We have a lot of people that are able to go to the internet or coding boot camp or anything and get a job as a coder because they can just prove that they can do the skills. But by and large, there's a huge movement in UX to require a degree of some sort, a 4-year degree. And then on top of that, like the degrees aren't even super relevant to doing UX. And so I find that for me, the on-the-job education that I received for UX was so much more valuable. And then things like mindfulness training, empathy, like that's so much more relevant to my job than going to college was really for me. I learned how to use Adobe really, really well, but I think I probably could have done that elsewhere. And so it puts a barrier between a lot of people and getting to UX or getting to tech in general because of that. And then what we have end up happening is we have design as a field and UX as a field becomes a very privileged dominated workforce. And then we don't have those voices of disabled people, of other people that, are then the subject of, oh, we need to hire for inclusion. Like, how do we find people that, can speak for the people that we don't have on the workforce because we don't have these people because it's so dominated by privilege and by people that aren't marginalized. How do we find people to speak for the marginalized people? So I find that this is a problem because industrialized education is a problem, but then also industrialized education is behind. So they're not teaching the things that are most relevant. So if industrialized education was more helpful, then I would say, sure. And then we need to make it more accessible. But I find that those are two problems that really feed into each other. And we could be doing so much more just to educate on empathy and UX. And people sometimes just don't believe that it's a problem. They're like, well, it's not a problem for me. I don't need to use screen reader. I don't need to use until it affects them. Like the issue of like sometimes people don't install door openers on doors until they have like an ADA complaint. So I've worked at so many tech places in downtown Manhattan where I've gone and my arms have been full and I can't find a door opener. And so then somebody has to run and open the door for me because I'm carrying like a bunch of stuff up. Or I've got, I'm on crutches or something because I sprained my ankle and I'm temporarily disabled. But for many people that have mobility impairments, that's their life every day. And then so what are these companies expecting? That they're just not going to be accessible even physically until they're made to be?
Right. And,
so
and what they're missing is that like a disability isn't always as visible as holding an armful of books.
Exactly. Or having a mobility device or being a wheelchair user.
Right. And so it's very easy to say, well, obviously we would accommodate, but like, who are we accommodating? Like you hear that, and you hear that on the web as well. I think like sometimes because it's not something that's natural, and like we're not capable of detecting like a screen reader user, for example. And I think that that's great. Like we shouldn't be able to do it. And I think like I'm almost I'm like worried about any time we create accessibility functionality that communicates like one's disability status to an application, because
yes.
Well, what are we doing there? But also what sort of behavior on the development side are we going to incentivize? All of a sudden now, like I'll say it again, we're bifurcating the experience, or we have the ability to.
Yeah, so like dark mode has been a really contested thing because some people are like, dark mode, it's such like a pop thing, like, oh, designers and developers just love dark mode. And it started as an accessibility thing. Like I find it a lot easier on my eyes, and it's a lot easier for me to read that way. And I know a lot of other people that have eye conditions that it's easier for them to read, and it also helps with eye strain. So people that spend a lot of time looking at screens do tend to prefer it. I guess it also does look kind of slick, so cool. I guess it has that Mac chic look, but like I love that it's not called accessibility mode. Like, because then what if it's just your preference? What if that's just the way you like to work? I don't think that we should have to make pathological something that is just a difference. Like the fact that some people wear glasses is not pathological in our society. And so we kind of move the needle on what is a disability and what isn't.
And we reinforce it, I think, with like the symbols that we use. Yes. Like one thing that like is funny to me is, at the Oculus, when you're going down to that PATH station.
Yes.
And those doors are so heavy that they like zip tie them with like the biggest zip ties I've ever seen in my entire life. They just zip tie most of them open most times a day. But then all the way on one side, there's a door that closes and opens, and it's got the like handicap symbol button on it to open it. Nobody can open that door. I can't open that. It's a two-hand, use my whole body weight situation to get one of those doors open. So we're like, maybe again, that's like a signal that like maybe we're thinking about this in a very narrow way, that like only people sitting in wheelchairs are going to need to use the door opener. You know, it's the same thing for like a ramp or anything else. This it's for everybody. And if we thought about it this way, I just know that we'd approach it better.
Absolutely. I totally agree. And also, I just think that if we thought about people with disabilities being just people that see the world differently, and we didn't think about like normal people versus people with disabilities, and that's something that one of my upcoming guests, Kat from Stark, is really working on, is to like change language around how we look at talking about even designing for accessibility. But like, so instead of saying like normal mode, it's original mode. So like you look at your original versus your like edited mode. So that's when you like correct it for contrast. So we're not correcting for color blindness, we're correcting for contrast.
Right.
It's the correct contrast. It's not like colorblind contrast. So I really appreciate things like that, because we're taking some of the pathological nature out of having a disability, and it's still allowing people like myself, who I want to push for disability acceptance. I do want to acknowledge that it is a disability. I don't have a problem with saying I'm a person with a disability, I'm disabled. Like, I don't have a problem with self-identifying that way. And I don't think that people should be afraid to use my identifier like that. But I also think that it could be less pathological, because like people will tell me like, oh, I don't know how you do that. I don't know how you live like that. I don't know how you used a cane. And so there's obviously like a lot of fear and disgust around people living with disabilities, especially when they're young. Mm-hmm. Because they're like, oh, I thought that happened to old people. Like I would be the end of my life, like all this other kind of stuff. And I'm like, are you telling me that, like, are you telling you wouldn't want to live anymore? Like, I have a very full life as I am. And even when I was like less sighted, I have a very full life, and I contribute to a lot of things. I have a lot of things that I enjoy. And so I think that the discussion around disabilities and calling it more just like design for everybody and not saying like, oh, it's designed for normal people and we're also designing for people with disabilities, is such a great conversation. So yeah, I have a lot of feelings about this.
It's amazing how much like those sorts of like qualifications, perspectives, and like use of language and symbols can color an experience like that, or make you look at a certain person in a certain way. And like, that's, I think, one of the adventures that I'm having, like working in and around UX, is when you tell the story and you choose the language, visual, verbal, whatever it is, you get to send the message in the medium that you like and portray things in the most objective like light that you can. And it I don't know, you said critical thinking in that last episode, and that just like is running through my head over and over again, because that's what it is. It's like, it's application of empathy to everything to the greatest extent possible, and that doesn't come for free.
That is what drew me to UX. Is it's critical thinking, it's problem solving, but it's also like not forgetting the human aspect of it. It's observing too. So if you've ever like really enjoyed bird watching or people watching, I feel like, you know, UX is a good way to really dive into that. And if you're interested in social good, like, it's really naive, but my new tagline has become like changing the world to be more diverse, inclusive, and accessible. Like and accessibility doesn't have to just mean for people with disabilities. It can be for people that are at different price points because they have different financial means, different classes, different languages. We're talking about like globalization now. Like, how do I, as someone who comes from a different culture in America, in the United States specifically, design for someone that lives on a completely different continent because my company is international? Like, so it brings up a lot of really different things. And what you said about like telling the story and choosing the words, it is really empowering, but it's also a lot of responsibility.
For sure. With great
So,
power.
yes, exactly. Oh man, now I feel like Spider-Man again.
Again?
Yeah, so that's actually part of my origin story, is that I started out on GeoCities websites. So I tell people I was bitten by a radioactive GeoCities website, and that's how I started with UX, is that I got into design through GeoCities.
I love that.
I mean, we all have this innate desire to do storytelling, and I think as a UX person, I love doing storytelling, and that's part of why I wanted to do this series, and not to do like a bunch of webinars with slides and things, because it lets us focus more on the storytelling and the conversation.
This is great. I'll talk about big picture for hours with you. This is so much fun.
Well, we have like a couple more minutes. Is there anything that you want to share with people to close out, or any way that you want them to be able to find you on the internet?
Well, you can find me on LinkedIn. That's going to be pretty easy from this video.
Okay.
Yeah. As far as closing remarks, I'll just say, if you want to create a culture for inclusive design, make it an inclusive culture.
Excellent. Well, Connor, it's been such a pleasure. I always enjoy getting to talk with you. Thank you so much for your time.
This is great. Thanks for having me.
All right, so everybody that's watching, next time we're going to have Eric from the Ally Project, and we're going to talk about, which, if you remember a couple of weeks ago, like the first of this month, we had Eric on, and we talked for like 2 hours. This time we're probably going to be a little bit more focused, and I'll be sharing what the topics will be, so you can tune in if you're interested in listening. But it will be a really good time, so join us next week, and I'll be posting soon. So thank you again for joining us for Feature Disabled. Have a great week. Oh my gosh, so many